So my understanding or associations with Nietzsche were of a kind of chauvinist, very masculine posturing that I just found kind of repellent. I also had, I don't know where I got this from, or I thought I knew that he ended up talking to his horse, that he went mad and spoke to his horse or to a horse. And there is an epigraph at the beginning of Bellatar's Turin Horse. I can't even remember what the epigraph is, but it's something about Nietzsche being mad and his mother. So I had very confused and idiosyncratic understanding of Nietzsche when I came at Beyond Good and Evil. Now, it's definitely true that there are some grotesque ideas in this text, and that he occasionally writes with a bitterness that is hard to swallow. And I think some of that bitterness is undeniably attributable to the fact that his work was completely overlooked in his lifetime. Finally, Nietzsche says lots of straightforwardly repellent things about women. And this is all the more frustrating in a text that is committed with such bracing power to interrogating received wisdom and structures of privilege. I can see how some people, quite apart from what turns out to be a caricaturist misinterpretation of his basic ideas, would be totally put off by this rank misogyny, and I think that's fair enough. Ultimately, we each make our own decisions about what we can and can't stomach about an artist's less palatable ideas. I always remember giving up on Everybody's Autobiography by Gertrude Stein because I just got totally sick of her talking about her servants in the same way that she talks about her dogs. She was a terrific writer, but just incredibly pompous and self-satisfied, and eventually I just found it too repellent to go on with. I've struggled with lots of philosophy in the past. I don't have a logical mind, and I find any kind of deductive logic really difficult to follow. Analytic philosophy, for example, just leaves me floundering. I've read some Wittgenstein, and although I understand the individual words, I've struggled to make any sense of it whatsoever. And so it was really a really bracing surprise to come across Nietzsche and find that while it's the analytical rigour and clarity of his ideas that make him so convincing, what makes him so compelling is the confrontational poetry with which he writes. Nietzsche writes not as though the ideas he's presenting are radical challenges to received wisdom, but as though this is in fact common sense. And he writes with this breathless impatience, as though he can't understand why other people don't accept and see that this is just the way things are. Nietzsche's attack on Christianity is really striking. The rejection of pomp and idolatry and the ritualistic nature of organised religion is familiar enough. Of course, Jesus himself rejected a lot of that stuff. But what Nietzsche resents is the very ethic of Christianity. So in short, Plato posits an ideal that is beyond death and decay, and virtue is attained through knowledge of that ideal. Now, Nietzsche suggests this is a kind of avoidant decadence, and Christianity, therefore, which mirrors this structure, is what he calls a decadence for the people. So he sets out his stall by virulently undermining the Christian ethic. This is a really interesting and characteristic tactic. Nietzsche consistently politicizes ideas, and he brings that same tactic to bear on philosophy. Many or most philosophies are committed to identifying and describing the ground on which morality rests. Nietzsche, rather than doing the same, takes a step backward from that endeavour and suggests that this assumes there is such a thing as morality in the first place. This is a major and consequential step Nietzsche takes, because it allows him to go on to suggest that what we commonly think of as good is in fact good for us. That is, systems and structures that are in place to reaffirm a sense of privilege beneficial to us is very readily acknowledged as just and natural, or simply the way things are. In fact, there is no universal morality, simply because such a notion would upset those same structural hierarchies, And so our very concept of morality is really just a way of disguising biases. And Nietzsche writes that philosophers therefore become cunning pleaders for their prejudices, which they baptize truths. So he is profoundly sceptical of the whole philosophical stance which positions itself as ready and able to identify universal truths and first causes, because in fact philosophers are always writing from a very specific perspective. Of course, we are reluctant to acknowledge and accept as socially constructed those truths which are beneficial to us. And the fact that Nietzsche begins his argument by challenging us to do so is, I think, really quite extraordinary. There is not a morality, there are any number of moralities depending on where you stand. I don't think we can overestimate the value and impact of this idea. Without this necessary hinge in philosophy, this acceptance or suggestion at least that what is presented as a truth should be scrutinized with some degree of skepticism, because it is often, if not usually, actually just a form of power at work. These are fundamentally important ideas, and without them you don't have the major schools of thought that I'm familiar with from English lit classes, things like post-colonialism and feminist theory and intersectional race theory, ways of switching one's perspective and accepting that what is normal is really just normal for me. So what is presented as given by philosophers is often, Nietzsche says, just an expression of their own particular experience, prejudice, bias and belief. Or as Nietzsche puts it, it has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy has hitherto been, a confession on the part of its author and a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. So we learn less about first causes through reading philosophy than we do about the philosophers themselves. Later, Nietzsche analyses thought and language with such astute prescience, he seems to anticipate Derrida. So he's analysing the idea, the sentence "I think," and he writes, "This I think presupposes that I compare my present state with other known states of myself in order to determine what it is. On account of this retrospective connection with other knowledge, at any rate, it possesses no immediate certainty." So what he is describing there is meaning as contingent on a chain of associations. And this is, of course, largely how meaning is constructed. On a very basic level, a house is bigger than a shed but smaller than a mansion. House in itself has no immediate certainty. In other words, there is no transcendental signifier on which meaning is founded. There is no stable and fixed meaning, and so there is fantastic room for slippage and miscommunication. Nothing is fixed. Nietzsche extends this skepticism into the idea of free will. He writes, "Willing takes place only where the effect of the command, that is to say obedience, that is to say the action, was to be expected. The appearance has translated itself into the sensation." In other words, when the effect tallies with what we expected it to be, we often experience the event as having been the result of our conscious will. If, for example, we accidentally slam a door, then we don't experience it as something we willed because we didn't expect the effect. This is an incredibly modern conception of free will. I encountered this prior to Nietzsche through Dan Wegner's book, The Illusion of Conscious Will, where he describes the sensation, the physical phenomenon of having willed something as a clever trick the brain plays, a sensation we experience after the fact in order to make us feel agential. This trick the brain plays gives us the impression that we're in control of what we do. This is a productively skeptical notion because it bolsters Nietzsche's central ambition here, which is to destabilize commonsensical notions of good and evil. And he goes on to prefigure people like Merleau-Ponty when he analyses perception and suggests that actually perception is largely made up of guesswork. He uses the example of reading. We don't read every word, we get the gist of sentences. And equally, we don't consciously see everything we look at. We assemble sense through what we expect to see. As he puts it, we fabricate the greater part of the experience and can hardly be compelled not to contemplate some event as its inventor. All this means we are from the very heart and from the very first accustomed to lying. He then softens that interpretation by saying, to express it more virtuously and hypocritically, in short, more pleasantly, one is much more of an artist than one realises. We piece together our own reality through guesswork. The idea that what I see is the way things are is simply not true. It's truer to say that what I see is simply the way things seem to be to me. He goes on to challenge the very notion of the I. He says this it, in the idea of it thinks, already contains an interpretation of the event and does not belong to the event itself. The inference here is in accordance with the habit of grammar. Thinking is an activity. To every activity pertains one who acts. Consequently, I am the one who acts. This prefigures a kind of analysis of the self that is dominant in contemporary philosophy of mind. In short, perspective or self is the locus through which experiences occur. And as I recognise that phenomena, I bring it into being. In other words, as I recognise that I am the perspective through which these experiences are happening, that interpretive process is what pins down and equally and simultaneously gives birth to the self. In other words, the self is a performative act and describes a circularity. How we experience the world is not necessarily how the world is. It's just how we happen to experience it. Notions such as good and evil depend on our belief in antitheticals, in fixed ideas, in truth. And Nietzsche is slowly eroding the ground on which these assumptions are based. So we have an interrogation of morality that suggests what is commonly thought of as good is often just an unacknowledged shorthand for good for me. And we have a skeptical analysis of meaning that suggests there is no stable, fixed ground on which meaning rests, no universal truths. Finally, if structures of meaning and power are relative to my experience and my sense of self is itself a construct, the idea of a fixed and final morality no longer has any ground left to stand on. Nietzsche uses this as a starting point for his analysis of a herd morality, the instinct to follow causes merely for the sense of comfort and security this brings. In short, we like believing things. It helps us to orientate, it gives us a sense of purpose and makes us feel like we are in control of ourselves. It makes us feel agential. But Nietzsche is very skeptical about this instinct. This need seeks to be satisfied and to fill out its form with a content. In doing so, it grasps about wildly, according to the degree of its strength, impatience, and tension, with little discrimination, has a crude appetite, and accepts whatever any commander, parent, teacher, law, class prejudice, current opinion shouts in its ears. This is a really forceful plea, not to just do as you're told. And I think it's at this point his ideas start to taste kind of sour. You could argue that what he calls a herd instinct is what makes society possible. If we didn't obey the rules, you couldn't, for example, drive anywhere. No one would pay any attention to the traffic lights. Now, perhaps Nietzsche would say that, yes, it's hard to imagine the society we have without this herd instinct, without a sort of blind acceptance of structures of power and the idea of universal truths and binaries and antitheticals. Perhaps it's difficult to conceptualize the impact a rejection of all of that would have on our society, because it would radically transform and remake our society. Maybe that's the point. Fundamentally, the real question here is, does Nietzsche really mean that some people, and only some people, have the capacity to step beyond these structures, while the rest are just essentially sheep? The implications of all this are quite disturbing, and they remind me of that speech Shigalov gives in Dostoevsky's Demons, and he describes a utopian society which prefigures communism, but that society sours, and he concludes, "I am perplexed by my own data, and my conclusion is a direct contradiction of the original idea with which I start. Starting from unlimited freedom, I arrive at unlimited despotism." Now, we know what happens when a group of people decide they are not bound by commonly agreed principles of right and wrong. But equally, we know that if there is no challenge to orthodoxy, if there is no interrogation of received wisdom or what is being presented to us as just the way things are, then there is no progress. In other words, Nietzsche's work feels dangerous and edgy and risky and unsettling and thrilling in a way that is both quite upsetting and really invigorating. I don't really know how I feel about it, but I do understand how and why he is such a major force in Western philosophy.